Recording in progress. That's very good. And so in that context, you quoted Hilde Domin. Indeed, she knew him, or rather fleetingly, one has to say, because they did, in fact, board the same ship. That is true. Hilde Domin, as you know, she went to Mexico. Stefan Zweig also considered at some stage Mexico as some form of haven, certainly after 1939. But he was then not really serious about it and decided, as you know, eventually to move from the United States after a very brief visit there in 1940-41, respectively, to Brazil. But I'm not going to talk about Brazil. I'm not going to talk about the end, as it were. Much has been speculated about this end, from my point of view, perhaps too much. But what interests us here, also in this particular context, is, of course, this rather intriguing, let's use a positive word, an intriguing relationship that he entertained with Britain. Now, as I said, we could start really with end of February 1933. This is the time when he was determined to stay in England. But I think we have to also to look back slightly prior to the First World War, when he visited England for the first time, London to be precise, London together with Oxford. And when he wrote a few rather intriguing short essays on especially Hyde Park and also on Oxford. Oxford and Cambridge at the later stage, he will refer to as the two halves of the British brain. Rather interesting. And to a certain extent, perhaps true, perhaps not. But what is intriguing about this first cursory stage of Zweig's interest in England has a great deal to do with his relatively early fascination with Charles Dickens. And it has to do with his, in inverted commas, discovery of William Blake. He was very serious about Blake in particular. This can also be seen by the way in which he famously collected autographs. And he had Blake autographs, he had Dickens autographs. And this is a chapter which, again, would deserve special attention, the way in which Zweig collected. The collected Zweig, however, is a topic that has been, in my view at least, very sufficiently and convincingly exhausted by Oliver Matuszek, who has written not only a masterly biography on Zweig, but also focused very strongly on the meaning of collecting autographs in Zweig's lifetime. Now, however, I would like to start not so much with 1933, but let's focus on 1935 for one particular reason. 1935 is the year when England acknowledged as the first country worldwide the Third Reich in diplomatic terms. Because Stanley Baldwin, as Prime Minister, signed the so-called Fleet Agreement with Hitler. And the Fleet Agreement of 1935 was, in the Western world, at least to some, a shock. Others felt it was the right move, simply because it meant that England was determined to commit the new regime in Germany to a particular contingent, as it were, of the Navy. And from Baldwin's point of view, this was absolutely understandable, because he felt, quite rightly, that the beginnings of, shall we say, the antagonism between England and the German Reich around 1900 had a great deal to do with the Navy, as we all know. By signing this treaty, the famous Flottenabkommen, Baldwin felt that he had actually done something positive by roping Hitler in a constructive way. Now, we have a few comments by Zweig on that move, diplomatic move on the British side, and they are relatively tentative. He isn't quite sure whether this was a good move or not, as so many other commentators were too. But on a more literary side, we have to see that by 1935, Zweig was able to publish the finished biography on Maria Stuart. And the Maria Stuart biography is, by almost any standards, an extraordinary achievement. It is an achievement that had something to do with his devotion to not just Mary Stuart, not just Marie Antoinette and others on whom he wrote biographies, but on historical research as such. Zweig turned from 1933 onwards definitely into a considerable historian, which is often overlooked because we regard, especially the Marie Antoinette biography, more in literary terms. But the ground research that Zweig did, especially for Mary Stuart, in the British Library, the British Museum, was literally second to none. We have a similar attempt on Zweig's side already slightly earlier. In 1934, he published his biography on, short biography, on Erasmus of Rotterdam. And we know one thing for sure, he was also interested at that time in producing, shall we say, double biographies, the kind of thing that is nowadays more fashionable. So he wanted to put beside Erasmus, he wanted to put Thomas More. It didn't come to that. But with Erasmus, he demonstrated that he was not just the raconteur, he was not just the narrator of stories, and he wanted to be more than that. He wanted to be a credible, historically founded biographer. And I dare say he achieved that. He achieved it predominantly with Mary Stuart, but also with Marie Antoinette, which at the time was quite an extraordinary venture, because as a figure, she was at the time regarded as basically uninteresting. The subtitle of the Marie Antoinette is also remarkable because he calls her ein mittlerer Charakter, a middle-range character. That is to say, he didn't want to glorify her by any means. He also didn't want to glorify Maria Stuart, by the way, but he wanted to depict a female in the situation just prior to the French Revolution, and what it meant to someone, to a female aristocrat of highest distinction, to be thrown into a role that she found very difficult to master. With Mary Stuart, we have a different case. As we all know, she was perfectly able and perfectly fit to govern. And whenever she could, she did. She did as a very, very young, not quite credible because she was too young, Queen of France. And then eventually, of course, with her claim to the Scottish throne and the English throne, it was obviously up to her to really make a mark. And this is what interests Zweig. He is interested not just in the famous moments in history, the turning points. He was always concerned with turning points in history, but he's also interested in individual characters who actually brought about this turning point. He needed for this research, obviously, England. He needed from 1933 onwards parallel to his research on Erasmus, he needed the British Library, he needed the resources in London to work on Mary Stuart. There is a time when we think, also judging from his correspondence, that he almost forgot what was happening outside of the British Library, or rather the British Museum at the time. He was so engulfed, he was so engrossed in what he was doing. And sometimes you have the feeling that he suddenly wakes up and thinks, hang on, there is something else happening out there. I have to be active, politically even. Why? Because he realizes by 35 that London would be a very interesting glacis to do something proper for the Jews. For the Jews who had by then already suffered the race laws in the Nuremberg race laws of 34. He contacts in Switzerland from London, he contacts Chaim Weizmann. Chaim Weizmann was the president at the time of the International Jewish Assembly. And he is keen to set up some form of, shall we say, joint protest in letter form, in pamphlet form, in London, to alert other governments in particular, including the Baldwin government, of what is actually going on in Germany. By 1935, he also knew one thing, that the situation in his own country, namely Austria, was, to put it mildly, dire. And what he had to experience in 1934, a search of his house in Salzburg, or the Kapuzinerberg, where the Austro-fascists, who were by then in power under Dollfuss, assumed that he would hide in this enormous house on the Kapuzinerberg guns for the communists. It was as absurd as it sounded. And anyone who knew anything about Zweig at the time would have thought this is madness. This is about the last person who would even go anywhere near a rifle. To him, it was a shock of a most colossal form. And that is the moment when he decided to leave Salzburg, first of all via Switzerland, then he went to England again. He thought for good, but he wasn't quite clear about this, what for good really means. Zweig is the incessant traveler, let's not forget this. And as an Austrian citizen, he was in the position to travel relatively freely, forget about Germany, but anywhere else, more or less until the Anschluss, until 38, until March 38. And he does this extensively. Travel is to him not just change of scene, not just picking up a few thoughts on the way. To travel means for him very much a condition de vivre. This is how he wants to live. That is to say, what he does in London, in his flat, 11 Portland Square, Portland Place, in W1, was a kind of interim. Although he writes to his publisher, Kippenberg, at the time, by the way, he's no longer his publisher because Kippenberg, Insel Verlag, was a problem. Kippenberg decided to compromise with the regime. And this is a story of its own, but it caused a major rift between his cherished publishing house, Insel Verlag, Kippenberg, and himself. But nonetheless, there were still contacts between the two. And in 34, Zweig says to Kippenberg, well, yes, I want to stay here in London now for good. This is my place. And then he soon realizes perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps something else was waiting for him. And this is the kind of thing he always brings across also in his letters to friends, that something was waiting for him elsewhere. Be it Scotland, be it somewhere in England. Mind you, he either thought London or Scotland. There was very little in between from his point of view. Frankly, I don't think he ever traveled into the Midlands or north of England, not at all. He would go to Bath eventually, as we know. Yes, that is the major excursion, but that's where it stops. But he is a traveler as far as Britain is concerned. He is a traveler in his mind. He is the one who thinks he absolutely knows every place where Mary Stuart ever was. His approach to Mary Stuart is so significantly different from, shall we say, Schiller's famous drama, simply because he uses different source material. He uses more up-to-date source material. He can interpret this figure as a credible alternative to Elizabeth, but at the same time, he pays a clear homage to Elizabeth I and also shows her dilemma. I'm not suggesting by any means that what Schiller did in the famous drama was taking sides too much. We also have in Schiller's drama the real dilemma of Elizabeth. Of course we have. And she, at the end of the play, as you may remember, she is very much on her own. She's alone. All her advisors have left her in Schiller's play. Not quite the case with Zweig. I don't want to go into detail about this too much, but I just want to indicate to you, this is someone, Zweig that is, this is someone who really wants to go to the roots. He wants to find out how England, Tudor Scotland for that matter, ticked. And then he is interested in how this modern England ticks. And that, to him, remains in so many ways a mystery, a reason for irritation, massive irritation, especially during the period of the so-called phony war. We will come back to that later. And also, of course, at the very moment when he loses his citizenship after the Anschluss. And England treats him, like all other foreigners, as enemy alien. And this is something which, from his point of view, was the worst thing that could have happened to him. He is now seen, at least that's his perception, he is now seen after 38 as someone who is also on a kind of hit list. At least this is how he saw it. And when you look at the way in which the first, and I have to be very specific here, the first wave of internments in Britain occurred, think of the Isle of Man, think of Hutchinson, the Hutchinson camp. We had a situation where Germans, ordinary Germans who happened to be in Britain at the outbreak of the Second World War, some of them merchants, some of them businessmen, Nazi supporters, whatever, were put together as enemy aliens with Jews, with communists, in one camp, in several camps on the Isle of Man. It has taken years and decades in Britain to really, really unearth the reality of these internment camps. And we now have, in fact, two major studies on the subject, which I think are revealing, extraordinary, bold, courageous. At the same time, let's be absolutely clear about this, an internment camp should not be compared with a concentration camp. These are different things. In public debates, in public discourses, this is often mixed up, deliberately or not. But it is an absolute truism that the British experience of setting up first concentration camps during the Boers War informed the way in which the first set of internment camps were set up after 1939. Zweig was acutely aware of this. Zweig was terrified, absolutely terrified that this would also be his fate. Together with his then still secretary, the liebes Fräulein Altmann, as he would refer to her, right to the point of marriage. And as a Jewish refugee from Berlin, she was also precisely in that danger. Thanks to remarkable connections that he had, particularly to a young publisher, Desmond Flower, he was spared from this. But, and this has something to do with Zweig's ambiguity about England, but he felt that the way in which the Chamberlain government went about in terms of setting up these internment procedures, that was highly problematic, highly difficult, and highly degrading for those who had actually resisted Hitler or escaped from him. So this is, with a broad brush stroke, as it were, the main layer over our topic. The subtexts, and this is a plural that I think is necessary, the subtexts are naturally more subtle. And I go back to my year 1935. Why? Because in this case, we see a Stefan Zweig who wants to maintain a very active link between Paris and London. He entertains a very vivid correspondence right until basically 1937 with Romain Rolland, the great French intellectual and writer. And they, I wouldn't say fell out, but there was a serious estrangement between the two simply because Rolland was much, much more lenient towards Stalin and Stalinism. Zweig at first also saw the advantages of the new regime in Russia, especially when he visited Moscow in 1928. Rolland was much more favorable towards what was happening in Russia, and Zweig was disappointed, let's put it that way. He was disappointed by that reaction of his very close friend. But we have others, particularly in Paris, where he wanted to form something which you could almost describe with the famous title of a Dickens novel, The Tale of Two Cities. The Tale of Two Cities, in case of Stefan Zweig, really consists of a few pages in his diary. He was not a very good diarist, one has to say. Diary was not his thing. But occasionally he would keep to it. And eventually would even write a diary in English. He was painfully aware of his deficiency in the English language. He's embarrassed by it. He says so in correspondence, for example, with a fine scholar of German literature in the London of that time, namely William Rose. And the Zweig-Rose correspondence has been published. And it had basically one major topic, and the topic was, interestingly enough, Rilke, because Rose somehow heard that Zweig knew Rilke and would have something exciting to say to his students. That is back in 36, 37. And Zweig is very reluctant and says, well, I'm not really up to this, do write something about Rilke. I might introduce the talk, but that's where it stops. But it is the Rilke interest that was very strong in Rose. And admittedly, it was also very present in Zweig. But what we find in 35 following, right up to 1338, is a very serious attempt on Zweig's part to anchor in Britain. He wants to mobilize his contacts. He keeps saying that he has nobody who really supports him. Not quite true, incidentally. We know of a BBC television broadcast that was recorded in a BBC studio, basically opposite of Portland Place where he stayed. But the actual footage isn't there. We only have one photograph that shows him in front of this enormous camera. We know that Desmond Flower, the publisher, tried his utmost to make Zweig popular in literary circles in London in particular. Not without, shall we say, success, because H.G. Wells, for example, felt that Zweig was an important figure. And he certainly thought so after he had read several translations of Zweig's works in English. And the translations, especially by Winston, the translations are by and large quite remarkable achievements at the time, because one has to say right to the very day, one always feels he reads better. If you want to read Zweig in a foreign language, he reads very well in French. And it's not surprising that he is now part of the Pléiade. With English, one always felt it wasn't quite Zweig, until, in our time, Anthea Bell came, and Anthea Bell's translations of Zweig's, most of his works into English, especially his stories, shorter stories, but also Ungeduld des Herzens, is translated as Beware of Pity, 1939, are second to none. I think one can say that. Part and parcel of the reason why Zweig is so prominent now in the Anglo-Saxon world has a great deal to do with Anthea Bell's, the late Anthea Bell's translations. But that's just an aside. The Winston translations that made his name quite clearly in the Anglo-Saxon world were absolutely respectable, yes. But Zweig had a similar problem with his English translations as Thomas Mann had. And both felt that they were simply not adequate in terms of subtlety, in terms of the way in which the German language can, for example, play with abstracts, with abstractions. That drove Thomas Mann to despair, Zweig to a lesser extent, because there are not so many abstract concepts in Zweig's writings, one has to say. He is very, very strong when it comes to, shall we say, bringing about the sensuality of language. That is his forte. But where his English translations suffer is the pathos. I mean, you have a lot of pathos in Zweig. His critics always said overrated pathos. Yes, probably true. He is a writer of immense empathy with his objects. And this is, on the one hand, welcome from, shall we say, the critics' point of view of the 1930s in England, but they're also suspicious of it. It's too much. It is, you would say nowadays, too sugary here and there. But I mentioned Thomas Mann, and let's not forget one thing. When you look at the distribution of German language literature worldwide in the 1920s and 30s, Stefan Zweig is number one, much to Thomas Mann's dismay at the time. He was aware of this. And there is a letter that, interestingly enough, the very first letter that Zweig wrote from London when he settled there, is directed to Thomas Mann when he lived in the first part of his exile in Zurich. And he basically says to him, for work reasons and other reasons, I really need to be here now. And he gives a long spiel about how he feels about this change of culture, etc., etc. He feels intrigued, and at the same time is also not sure how sincere this British culture is. This bothers him a great deal. When you look into Thomas Mann's diaries, you will find the following sentence. Thank goodness Zweig didn't read this. Thank goodness Zweig never, ever learned what Thomas Mann really thought of him, because Zweig revered him. There's no question about it. Mann respected him up to a point. And Mann says in this diary, when he has received this letter from Zweig in London, Zweig is recuperating from fascism in England, full stop. That is as problematic as it can be. And when you write on Zweig and when you write on Thomas Mann, and it is often a question of getting hot and cold. Sometimes you feel, my goodness, what on earth was happening actually in Thomas Mann for these rather vitriolic remarks, especially in his diaries on Zweig. But that's a different topic. How are we doing time-wise? I continue. Okay. Well, in that case, I would really bother you with some text that has to do with this final phase of Zweig in England. That is to say, after he got married and after he moved to Bath, where he really thought he would stay for much longer. And as we know, he didn't, just for a couple of months. I termed this section, small section, waiting, 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 and soon despairing, and the farewell to Freud. With the outbreak of the Second World War, Zweig, now an enemy alien, became a diarist again, at least for a short while. Once again, he said he wanted to provide himself with a picture of the time, only to give up his attempt after the 17th of October, 1939. Following the German invasion of Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands and France, he started recording events again in the diary from the 22nd of May, 1940, and continued to do so until June 1940, when his suitcases were packed for his final departure from England to Brazil via New York. The diary contains snippets of impressions, what it was like to live through the so-called phony war, a period, in Zweig's words, of waiting, 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 and soon despairing. From his point of view, this phoniness was nothing but political suicide of the West. The entries amount to a record of Zweig's despair at the increasingly hopeless-looking situation with the likelihood of a German invasion of the British Isles growing by the week, and what looked like to him the complete inactivity of both the British and French governments, an object of controversy amongst historians to the very day. Even though he speaks with admiration of the English calm, endurance, and resolve to resist Hitler, he remains critical of the British government acting only tentatively and all too late. Zweig notices with dismay that people were asked to keep a distance from any German or Austrian in their vicinity. He feels humiliated by such treatment, realizing that as a German-speaking Jew, he was doubly exposed as he senses resentment, if not hatred, against Jews amongst ordinary people in England too. His resume reads in English, "I should not stay in this country after the war. I'm tired of all ideas of future." Hilledomin would not have said this. Significantly, the first part of his war diaries is written in English, whilst the second part of his notes he reverses into German. Zweig's English diary illustrates his concern that he could not effectively communicate in English, and yet the irresistible flow of his prose, his agitation and despair comes through quite clearly, despite his Germanic syntax and stylistic glitches. This is original Zweig in English. "I regret only to have no opportunity to write, as I am unable to do it in English, and have nobody here to rectify my mistakes and to give more color to what I want to say. That's what oppresses most, that I am so imprisoned in language, which I cannot use. How different was it in those times in Austria and Switzerland, where I could speak in my own language and even encourage others." Moments of reprieve were rare. One of them was the 5th of September, 1939, when he and Lotte spent a fine day in Bath, which felt as remote as possible from any thought of war in the world. It is, incidentally, one of the few occasions when he refers, albeit very indirectly, to Lotte in these diaries, but only through one pronoun, we. Lunch in the spa, what a marvelous view, and in the afternoon, we make a walk from Clareston to the heights. How wonderful nature can make forget the silliness of mankind. End of quote. It is odd to find that Zweig in these diaries does not with one word consider Lotte's feelings. Her perspective on the move from London to Bath, not to speak of the war itself, seemed irrelevant to him. This is just as surprising as the ignoring of her and Friederike, his first wife, in The World of Yesterday, given that as a narrator and biographer, Zweig was an absolute master in understanding the female psyche. Zweig's last public appearance in London was on the 26th of September in the London crematorium in Golders Green, when Sigmund Freud was buried. In his diary, he notes the conspicuous absence of English literati at that occasion, let alone government officials, from the ceremony. Zweig spoke in German after Ernest Jones, one of Freud's closest collaborators. It was as if all of Zweig's, by then next to dormant rhetorical skills and verbal art history, was enlivened by this task. On barely 4 printed pages, Zweig put together an homage of Freud as a discoverer and explorer of the soul and a manifestation of what it means to believe in the independence of mind, in a heroically free spirit who worked against all odds. When Zweig deliberately uses the expression Finder and Führer to describe Freud's character, a discoverer and leader, then he tells his fellow mourners that not even the word Führer can solely be claimed by the destroyers of culture and civilization. By implication, he argues that it makes still sense to identify real leaders like Freud, whose example he characterizes as follows. He was, on the one hand, cautious, carefully examining, reflecting sevenfold, and doubting himself. But one thing he was certain, namely that he would defend it, this kind of attitude, against the entire world, if necessary. Freud's courage consisted of defending findings that others did not want and did not dare to find, let alone spell out or stand by them, as he put it. Just how much Zweig was moved by this occasion is reflected by his diary entry, whose English is even more shaky than usual. How kind Mrs. Freud says me, that the dear master loved me so much and expected always the day when I came to visit him. All the relatives showed themselves extremely kind and grateful to me. Freud, during the last 1.5 years of his life following his emigration to London, must have indeed appreciated Zweig's frequent notes from Hallam Street and then Bath. Zweig visited him shortly after his arrival in London with the young Salvatore Dali, a great admirer of the founder of modern psychology. Zweig's and Freud's exchanges remained indeed relatively intensive right to the end of Freud's life. In his last letter to Freud, dated 14th of September 39, he informs him of the fact that, as an enemy alien, he can now only move within a radius of 5 miles from the marketplace in Bath, adding, "Here I vegetate, silly and useless, not yet able to work properly and remote from all friends. I could laugh at this folly, considering that I could be more useful than even civil servants in the Ministry of Propaganda." He refers, by the way, to the Ministry of Information in the later Senate House of the University of London. "But this situation even spoils my joy in visiting you, which makes me sad. And yet," he says, "we need to remain steadfast. It would be pointless to die now without having seen the hell ride of these criminals beforehand." Visitors to Bath, he had indeed only very few, amongst them the young writer Richard Friedenthal, who was to become his secretary, first biographer and editor of his works, and the French art critic Louis Gillet. Friedenthal stayed from January to February 1940, when his internment set in. He was the first to write a fine novel about his experience, which he called Die Welt in der Nussschale, The World in a Nutshell, published in 1956. Incidentally, indeed, an extraordinary novel. I have, as they say, argued elsewhere for the urgent republication of this novel, and I hope it will come to fruition. Idleness was a luxury Zweig felt he could not afford. Friedenthal had hardly arrived in Bath when the long blackout evenings began, and Zweig suggested to his visitor and soon confidant to use this time for the translation of Irving Erdman's book, A Candle in the Dark. He had met Erdman, who held a chair for philosophy at the Columbia University in early '39. He praised the book in one of his last letters to Roland on the 13th of February 1940, calling it clear and courageous, in contrast to the lukewarm political views he had encountered among English writers and journalists. In his foreword to their translation, Zweig writes that they have no intention to sublimate their personal disturbance over the catastrophe of our European civilization, but to ask, with Erdman, how to safeguard ourselves intellectually in the chaos of our time. In political terms, and this is genuine new territory, in political terms, the other reference Zweig makes in passing in his letter to Freud is more intriguing and corresponds with an opaque reference to his visit to this very Ministry of Information that was indeed modeled on Goebbels' Ministry for Propaganda, and a meeting he joined there with 2 gentlemen, it's the only thing he says, on the 27th of May 1940. It is possible that one of the participants was Sir Arthur Beverley Baxter, the Canadian-British journalist, right hand of the newspaper tycoon Lord Beaverbrook, editor-in-chief of the Daily Express, member of Parliament for the Tory party, and fervent supporter of Chamberlain's appeasement policy. It was for Baxter that Zweig had written a memorandum on the political and strategic significance of Trieste on the 4th of January 1940. This text unearthed only in 2019, betrays Zweig as a sharp political analyst with a clear sense of strategic necessities, somewhat surprising given his pacifist beliefs, but perhaps a document that evidences at least a slight shift in his stance on timely military intervention. Zweig must have had information about German intentions to annex Trieste for strategic reasons, which in fact did happen in September 1943, when, after the Badoglio government agreed peace terms with the Allies and the Italian army was dissolved, the Wehrmacht established an operational zone under the name Adriatic Coastland, with Trieste at its center. Zweig rightly identified Trieste as the corpse, there's a quote by Zweig, as a corpse in the cellar of German-Italian relations, recommending that Britain should alert the Mussolini government of Germany's plan. His idea was to drive a wedge between the two dictators, as this would, or so he believed, shorten the war, declared by then, but not acted upon, with the tragic exception of Poland. I stopped reading this out here at this stage because I really felt I wanted to share this, in my view, absolutely remarkable document that shows Zweig, I dare say for the first time, as an acute and surprisingly acute political analyst. And I still can't quite get over the fact that what we read in this aide-memoire, you could say, for Baxter, was written by a dedicated pacifist. And my last comment on the subject before we enter discussion, as I think we will, we have one witness who commented very movingly on a situation where a group of people were sitting together in London discussing whether it is necessary to use force against Hitler or not, whether to really declare war on Hitler, whether really to open up the famous Second Front after Poland was invaded. And the witness we have is Franz Werfel. Franz Werfel, on his way then to exile, stopped also in London for a short while before he went to America. And Werfel says, at that point, when this discussion became serious, whether military force should be used, whether, in inverted commas, a proper war should be declared on Hitler, and not just a phony war, at that point, Zweig left the room. He couldn't bear it anymore to really see his fundamental belief after the First World War in pacifism, that should be now nil and void. At that moment, he clearly couldn't face it. We're talking about 38, end of 38. But in the Baxter memoir on Trieste, we clearly have a Zweig who has modified his views in this direction. To my knowledge, perhaps material will be unearthed to the contrary, perfectly possible. But to my knowledge, he never came back to this in the last, oh goodness, in the last two years of his life, where the question of pacifism doesn't really play a major part anymore, except of what he says in Die Welt von gestern. There we have clear indications that he went back to this view, especially when he talks about his conception of Europe, which was not identical, incidentally, with the pan-European idea of Coudenhove-Kalergi. But I'll rest my case. Thank you very much.
Well, we have been privileged to follow this tour d'horizon on a topic that is very controversial, that mirrored not only the literary expert, but also the historian. And I think that the one or the other aspect you would like to elaborate on. we are waiting for your questions. Also, the participants via Zoom, you just use this one button in reaction, raise your hands, and I see it, and then you can unmute and post your questions, and everybody can hear it at the same time. If you have a question, I will come up to you with a microphone so that our friends on the screen can also follow. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question with regards to his concept of Europe. I mentioned that I just read the new book of Timothy Garton-Ash, who referred twice to Zweig, and he said his concept of Europe was just Europe before the First World War, and he had no imagination how a new Europe could evolve in the end, and maybe this is a reason for his desperation. So I would, as you said, with reference to his pacifism, which was maybe easy referring to Europe before the First World War, did he have any ideas how this so-called phony war will end, and did he have, or did he bother about what Europe could be like after that?
It is indeed true, Zweig was not a constitutionalist. He was not somebody who thought in terms of political science, certainly not. Political pragmatics also seemed not quite within his reach. This is a writer. This is a literary figure of extraordinary eminence. This is someone who believed firmly in the European idea as a cultural phenomenon. This is not someone who, and one has to say, in good or problematic German cultural tradition, this is not someone who thought in terms of let's found a European Parliament. If you want to have the backdrop here, let's not forget that at the end of the 18th century, when the French mounted a revolution, German intellectuals, German idealists, hence we call them idealists, seriously believed, Schiller was one of them, that the theater, that the stage would be the proper parliament, would be the proper revolution. And Schiller's argument that the Mannheim Theater should become the Nationalbühne was to him significant, was important. Much more important than the idea of a Assemblée Nationale. To a certain extent, even Stefan Zweig is in this tradition. And we have very, very few writers at the time who really thought in concrete terms about what Europe should look like, could look like, in political terms, in constitutional terms, etc. He sees Europe as definitely a cultural entity. If anything, and we need for that, we very much need Die Welt von gestern as a reference work. That way, he is in parts quite political, certainly in the Hitler chapter, but also before. He clearly regards the Habsburg monarchy not as a model by any means. He is one of the first to accept that the monarchy is dead. But the construction of Habsburg as a Vielvölkerstaat, that is something that he almost takes for granted, that this would be the future of Europe. So we are not talking about Zweig, the explicit theoretician when it comes to European politics. we are talking about someone who takes a fair amount for granted. And just how much he took for granted, you will find when you go through the Welt von gestern. And you see all these references that he makes. To a contemporary readership, no explanation was necessary. Nowadays, and thank goodness we have, a very fine, Matusek again, we have a very fine commented edition of the Welt von gestern. But the comment section, where he simply only explains what Zweig means with certain concepts, is considerable. Because today's readership needs to be informed about these things. Okay, you can Google all of this, fine, wonderful, but perhaps you wouldn't. And it just shows that even with the construction of Europe, he believes that he can actually refer to a cultural model that once existed. Garten Ash is right in very many things, and like yourself, I really admire this book. Homelands is remarkable. But he should have perhaps mentioned Zweig not only twice, but a little bit more often, in order to explain what the difference is between Zweig's stance on Europe and, for example, Coudenhove-Kalergi. Because Coudenhove-Kalergi in Pan-Europe, the Pan-Europe idea, is much more ideological. Zweig, and I think this is something we have to realize, Zweig is someone who wants to defeat isms. He is not an ideologue by any means. And the last thing he wants is for Europe to adopt an ideology. This is the problem he has with the first appreciation of what the Soviet Union represents up to 28, basically. But at the same time, and let's be absolutely clear about this, Zweig, like many other poets, writers at the time, including Rilke, were, dare I say it, also fascinated by what fascism had to offer, especially in Italy. Not in Germany, but in Italy. He observed Mussolini very, very closely. Perhaps not as closely as Rilke in his last years, but Zweig as a collector does something extraordinary. In his collection, you have notes, Hitler notes, for a speech that he gave in his early years as a political propagandist. He's interested, Zweig is interested in the way in which particular thoughts spark, take off. Critics of Zweig have argued that there you are, it's typical. He even has a piece of paper by Hitler. It doesn't mean anything in real terms. What it really means is he's interested in the way in which thoughts form themselves. That is what is of importance to him. The Meaning of Creativity is a famous essay by him written in 1938. Interestingly enough, it is written just the drafts are a few weeks after the Anschluss. He has nothing more important to say than to ask the question, what does creativity mean? That really drives him. And Europe, from his point of view, is actually a space for creativity.
What an encouraging phrase. A space for creativity. Are there further questions? I don't see any from on the screen. It's as I said, the literary saloon, and this is an exchange of views. So if you have the one or the other question, you have by now experienced that there's hardly any topic that you cannot delve into. Well, obviously there are no further questions, neither from Frau Roth or Frau Kinsinger. Okay. Then we thank you again for the insight you gave us into Stefan Zweig being the hesitant Anglophile. We thank you for coming from London. probably the last time that you come to London. The next time we will welcome you, you will probably come from pretty close. Yeah, okay. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being on the screen and for joining us. Welcome. Best regards to Bonn, to Heidelberg, to Berlin. And on the agenda on the 26th of October will be a talk on Kindertransporte, a topic that is of great interest, and the lecturer will be one whose father was part of the Kindertransporte. So on the 26th of October, by the end of next week, you should have the invitation in the email box. So thanks for coming. Have a pleasant evening. I hope the rain stops so that you come, stops in time. And all the best. And please, that is something that I really hope that will succeed. Spread the news, bring your friends so that there are 30 in-house again. And more showed up than were on my list. This is also good news. And thank you to our very kind friends on the screen. Have a pleasant evening and goodbye.